Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ESOP Centre webinar. Could equity be used to replace a portion of employees' salary? And I am delighted to introduce to you today a team from White & Case LLP. My name is Ian Harris. I'm one of the directors of the Zien Group, and we run the ESOP Centre and have done so for the last few months. The agenda for this afternoon is a straightforward one. It says a 5-minute introduction, but I'm hoping to be out of your way well within 5 minutes. My role really is to get out of the way and let Nicholas Greenacre lead a panel discussion on this fascinating topic. I will, once I've finished my introductory remarks, move out of the way and switch off my screen so you won't see me during the panel discussion. What I would like you to do as members of the audience is to be thinking of questions that you want to ask of the panel, because I will return after their final thoughts for about 15 minutes of questions and comments. It's not very often that you get a panel of 4 leading lawyers from an international firm to answer your questions, and I feel I would be out of my depth asking all of the questions, so I really am reliant on you as the audience to come up with some good questions, and we would like you to send those questions in using the question facility within GoToWebinar. Please don't dig out our email addresses and send us the questions in the background. We won't get to them until after the webinar. If you do that, we will try to get through all of your questions if we possibly can. If we can't, we'll get back to you afterwards with answers to your questions. So it's definitely worth getting your questions into us. Before we start, I would like to thank all of the sponsors of the FS Club, which is the umbrella club within which the ESOP Centre sits, also run by Zien. And these organizations are the ones who basically sponsor what we do in this webinar program. Our webinar program is many and varied, and these organizations have been extremely generous and thoughtful in helping us to keep this webinar program going. Without them, we would not be able to do this. We would also like to thank the members of the ESOP Centre, who similarly are, in a sense, sponsoring what we do. So without further ado, I will hand over to Nicholas Greenacre. Nicholas is the Head of Employment, Compensation and Benefits at White & Case LLP. And he will lead this discussion with several of his colleagues, who I will leave him to introduce. So without further ado, Nicholas and team, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to the ESOP Centre and FS Club for inviting us along to do this webinar. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce my partners from 3 of our other offices. I'm based in the London office. Frank-Karl is based in our Frankfurt office. Alex is based in our Paris office, and Vicky in our New York office. And we form part of the Employment Compensation and Benefits team here at White & Case. We're an international law firm with 44 offices in 30 countries. So there's just a smattering, small selection of our lawyers in this specialist area. So what are we talking about today? Well, these are challenging times for everyone for reasons which I needn't go into. A major concern, not just in the UK, but across the world, is jobs. And the approach of the UK and other European governments has been to provide support to employers to enable them to continue to employ their people through the crisis. And the US has taken a different tack, with the emphasis largely being on support to those who are not in work. But that support has to end at some point. And in the UK, the furlough scheme has started to wind up, with the share of pay paid by government decreasing over the next couple of months. And the scheme is currently due to end at the end of October. And many employers are having to look for other ways to save costs in the face of revenues which are in many cases significantly reduced. And there are a number of potential ways of saving employment costs, the most obvious being redundancies. And there have been many redundancies already, sadly, as was highlighted in this month's bumper issue of the ESOP Centre newspad. And sadly, the pace and scale of these programmes, at least in the UK, seems likely to increase over the autumn as the furlough scheme ends. But today, we want to look at an alternative. We want to look at whether it would be sensible and practicable for employers to replace part of their employees' fixed pay with variable pay. And that variable pay would be dependent on the future performance of the company. That might be some kind of profit sharing arrangement, which could be paid in cash. But we're thinking today specifically of shares or share-based awards like options or restricted stock units as a replacement for fixed pay. So let's start by asking a question of you, the audience, and we'll ask you the same question again at the end to see if you've changed your mind. Could equity be used effectively to replace a significant proportion of an employee's salary? And you'll see on the screen there, you've got various options, and I'll leave you a moment to vote.
The votes are coming in thick and fast. Most people have voted. I'll just give you another 5 or 10 seconds, people. I'm going to close the poll.
Okay, so 67% yes up to a point, 24% maybe. So let's see whether we can shift some of those maybes to yes up to a point, or vice versa. So there are a number of themes to deal with from a legal, tax and practical perspective in considering this question. But I'd like to start with the issue of consent. So if employees have to agree to any change, then clearly, given the alternative of losing their jobs, perhaps it might be relatively easy to get them to agree, but it might not be so straightforward. So turning first to France and Alex, how would an employer modify an employee's remuneration? And what impact would a collective bargaining agreement or collective performance agreement have on that process? I think Alex is muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, in France, so the modalities for modifying the employee's remuneration depend on the way the remuneration was initially fixed. So as a general rule, the remuneration is set in the individual employment contract, and therefore the modification will require the consent of each employee. Sometimes you may have specific components of the remuneration, for example, profit sharing or seniority bonus, which are implemented by a collective agreement negotiated with the unions. So modification of these components will require a negotiation with the unions and the signature of a rider to this collective agreement. So this was the rules before 2017. In 2017, the President Macron decided to create a new kind of collective agreement named Collective Performance Agreement, which allows companies to modify existing employment contract provisions as well as in-house collective agreements, including the modification of the remuneration. Such agreement must be negotiated with the unions in order to meet operational needs of the company or to preserve employment. So if such agreement is signed, this agreement will be enforceable against all employees within the company, and their remuneration, even fixed in the contract, will be modified. And if they refuse the modification, the company will be in a position to dismiss them for a valid cause. Therefore, today, so this collective performance agreement is probably the most appropriate legal tool for French companies to modify employees' remuneration in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and related economic difficulties faced by the companies.
Thanks, Alex. It's interesting. And then, Frank, what considerations should German employers be aware of?
Yeah, sure. Even in Germany, it can make sense to ask employees to reduce their salary or convert it into participation of equity, at least for those employees who are currently not under a German short-time work regime and whose salary is not already reduced. However, it also requires the consent of the employee to reduce its salary or to use it for buying shares in the company, whereby if it's just structured as an offer to employees to use part of their salaries, then this can also be part and implemented in a collective agreement with the Works Council, where employees just have an offer to reduce the salary and buy shares for the company. And this can also make sense to base this on a collective agreement with the Works Council, because A, it may require the approval of the Works Council in any event, because if salary parts are converted or reduced, which are already implemented based on a collective agreement, then the waiver of such or benefits or salaries also requires the approval of the Works Council. And B, the setup of such an equity plan in principle is subject to certain co-determination rights of the German Works Council in Germany, not regarding the implementation of such a plan at all, but regarding which group of employees are able to participate, and in particular with regard to certain formalities, just like waiting period, blocking periods, forfeiture clauses, etc. However, if such a plan is not, and this is often the case, not directly implemented by the German employer, but for example, by a foreign company, the parent company, and structured as an offer to the German employees, then it's case law in Germany that this should not be part of the German employment at all, except for the German employer to withhold taxes and social security contributions. And the German Works Council doesn't have a say in that. There's no co-determination right in such a case. However, it is important in such a case that the German employer is really not actively involved in that plan. And final remark in Germany is that in particular, if it is intended to use base salary, certainly not the entire base salary should be reduced and converted, because that may be invalid, because it is the case that employees would use their base salary and transform it into kind of variable salary, and this may be invalid in particular for, let's say, regular employees, depending on, I would say, the seniority and the overall remuneration. We would say that no more than, let's say, 30% of their base salary should be reduced and converted into the participation and equity plan.
Great, thanks, Frank. I'd imagine things are a bit simpler in the US as far as consent is concerned, Vicky.
Right, I think that's right, Nicholas. So I'll answer fairly quickly for the US. It is generally a lot more straightforward to make changes unilaterally in the US, because most employees are employed on an at-will basis. But where there are contractual entitlements to a certain salary, and that could be in a collective bargaining agreement, or it could be for more senior employees in an employment agreement, then it may be more difficult to make changes without consent. There may be an obligation to pay a certain salary. There may also be an entitlement, depending on how good reason or good cause is defined in that employment agreement, to resign and claim severance in the event that your salary is reduced without consent. So those sorts of provisions should be reviewed closely to make sure you're not inadvertently giving somebody the ability to resign and claim severance. Separate from consent issues, employers will just need to bear in mind applicable state notice requirements. They do vary from state to state in terms of when you're able to implement salary reductions, and notice is required in some states, such as New York, at least 7 days prior to a salary reduction. And the other thing to bear in mind, separate from consent, is obviously minimum wage requirements that vary from state to state, and ensuring you're not tripping those or going below a certain salary threshold that would impact the classification of your employees as exempt or non-exempt from overtime laws. But yeah, overall a lot more straightforward in the US on the consent side.
Thanks, Vicky. So moving now to the next topic of practicalities. From a UK perspective, there's a very common practice of salary sacrifice for pension contributions and other employee benefits, where employees will waive a portion of their salary in return for the promise of certain benefits, and they'll waive that absolutely before the entitlement to that benefit arises. That may be the way to achieve this scenario. However, because we have the furlough scheme in place at the moment, it may be that there are opportunities for employers to replace on the salary that has already been waived, that may have been waived on a permanent basis at the beginning of the furlough scheme. But that really depends on how employers have implemented furlough and how they've implemented specifically the reduction in wages that may accompany the furlough scheme, because not all employers have reduced their wages, although they've received the reimbursement for the wages from the government. So depending on how employers have implemented the furlough, it may be possible, it may be that employees have already waived their entitlement to salary, meaning that it's simply a question of making new equity awards to those individuals to replace their salary without having to seek their consent. But if not, then there's established practice in terms of salary sacrifice. Perhaps I can ask you, Vicky, under this theme of practicalities, of what kind of impact you think a change like this could have on a company's culture and the morale of its workforce.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. So I mean, clearly salary reductions are not welcome news, and in thinking about implementing a scheme like this, a key consideration has to be the impact on company culture and the morale of the workforce. I think the key thing that we've seen as being a focus for clients and being really important here is controlling the impact through transparency and messaging. So it'll be very important to, before implementing a program, decide on and communicate clearly and transparently about who the reduction program applies to, how long it's expected to last, what was the thinking behind it, why it's necessary for the health of the company, and why this and not other things such as layoffs and more furloughs or new furloughs have been considered. What are the benefits of it? Can it avoid or minimize other programs such as layoffs? And the opportunity to participate in future company growth with the replacement equity awards. And the other thing to communicate, and that's something that we've seen quite a lot in the market and with our clients, is that management's right there with the employees in these pay cuts. There are larger pay cuts generally for being implemented for more senior folk, and for public companies, there's public disclosure required around that, and it's an opportunity to show employees and shareholders that this is really something that is being implemented top down, and the messaging can be controlled, and it can be viewed in some instances as a positive step that's being taken. I think where we see things go poorly most often is where transparency allows rumours and distrust to fill the void, and it's that's most harmful to morale rather than the actual change itself and the implementation of a program like this. So spending time on the message is really important, and working through how to communicate how the change will impact employee benefits and other programs that are pegged off employee salary, such as contributions to pension plans, for 401k matching contributions, and paying attention to any discrimination issues in implementation. Have lawyers and HR review so there's no inadvertent discrimination in implementation, which can also impact morale. And so if done properly, communicating a program like this, I think, can help preserve morale by showing everyone from the most senior management down has skin in the game, and keeping employees in the loop regarding management thinking on how the company is looking to preserve cash and keep people employed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Alex, what would French employers need to consider along the same lines? And as a separate issue, are there any precedents for this kind of arrangement in France? you're muted again.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, first of all, I would say that all the remarks and recommendation of Vicky for the US would also apply for France. So we have the same issues, and it would be relevant. But before talking about the implementation of the scheme, which is important for France is is to have a strong and constructive dialogue between the social partners. If this strong dialogue does not exist, it will not be possible to implement the scheme. We must have a mutual trust between between each other, between the union's representatives, the employees, and the management. So that's why, like in the US, the messaging to present the plan will be crucial, and should insist, I would say, first on a common assessment of the financial difficulties which are faced by the company, and also on the necessity to implement collective efforts from all parties to cover the company's situation. So if we're able to have this common assessment and to also agree on the main measures to be taken, employees and unions may accept the principle of the reduction of the remuneration, which is a taboo in France, and the fact to offer these shares or restricted stock units to the employees. We have one precedent in France, which is quite old, 2003, but the facts are quite similar to the situation that we are facing today. In 2003, the airline company Air France faced major difficulties as a consequence of the competition, but also of the financial crisis. And they decided to negotiate a collective agreement with the unions to implement a mechanism of exchange of salary for shares. Basically, employees agreed on a reduction of the remuneration, and as a counterpart, they could acquire company shares, which were owned by the state at that time, with a discount and a favorable tax treatment. So this mechanism was implemented in 2003, offered to thousands of employees. That's the only precedent that we have in France. More recently, some startup companies in the tech business proposed some similar schemes to key management or key employees, where they agreed to a reduction of the salary, and as a counterpart, they were offered some bonds convertible in shares or shares. So we have such kind of precedent, but if the only major and material precedent is Air France, which could be replicated today under the collective performance agreement, which was created by President Macron.
Thanks, Alex. So turning on to the next topic of risks, I'd like to ask Frank how the equal treatment principle in Germany would affect an arrangement for replacing salary with equity.
Well, yes, thanks, Nicholas. Indeed, equal treatment principle, it's an issue that has to be reviewed always carefully when implementing such a plan. In particular, if this is combined with a certain, let's say, offer to have to a chance to get something more in the end than the employees have invested in, for example, because they can buy shares with a discount or get certain free shares in addition to the shares they have already they have purchased with their salary. The basic principle is in Germany that every employee should be treated equally, and the employer just needs a justifying reason if employees will be excluded from such a program or employees will simply be treated unequally. And if the employer violates that and does not have a justifying reason for treating employee differently, the consequences indeed is that such excluded employees are then also entitled to participate in the program, which could cause certain problems to the company. And there's a lot of case law in Germany, and even certain law says that, in particular for part-time employees, usually they cannot be treated worse than others. The German Fixed Term and Part-Time Act clearly state that part-time employees should not be treated worse like others, so should be treated equal. And this, in particular, if you exclude part-time employees, for example, from a participation in such a program, could in Germany also be indirect gender discrimination, for example, because the majority of part-time employees in Germany are female, and this could then cause additional costs like damages, damage payments, and these kind of things. The same more or less applies to fixed-term employees, whereby here there may be a justification for excluding them, in particular if their fixed-term employment is shorter than, for example, waiting periods or vesting periods, which are implemented in the plan. So there may be a justification for treating them differently. The same applies with regard to apprenticeships. There's indeed quite a common sense that they can, for example, be excluded and treated unequally because their main purpose is not receiving salary, but receiving education, and that's a valid reason for excluding them for such a plan, and even such minor employees with a very short, very low salary in Germany, not more than 450 euro per month, can also usually be excluded. Whereby it's again be often a difficult question whether it can be differentiated between hierarchical levels, for example, that only certain managers are entitled to participate and others not. It very much depends in the end on the purpose of the plan, on the intention of the employer to set up such a plan. If it is just for, let's say, saving liquidity, the situation may be different to those where employer also wants to award kind of, let's say, leadership skills or loyalty or that kind of stuff. So it very much depends on the purpose of the plan, whether and which employees have to be implemented, and whether certain groups of employees can be excluded from the participation in the plan.
Great, thanks, Frank. And Vicky, everybody loves to hear about 409A, so I'd love to ask you what risks employers would have to be aware of from a tax perspective in the US.
Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, right. I was going to say everybody's favorite US tax topic is 409A, and unsurprisingly, in implementing a program like this, employers will need to be careful not to trip any tax issues under 409A, which for those who have been lucky enough to avoid it to date, is a provision of the US tax code that deals with deferred compensation arrangements and takes quite a broad view of what deferred compensation arrangements are. So what a salary reduction alone won't trigger 409A concerns, but employers should be aware that a commitment to repay an amount of reduced compensation at a later date, be that in the form of salary at a later date or replacement equity awards that may be paid or vest at a later date, that may be a deferred compensation arrangement that's subject to 409A. Under 409A, the deferred compensation arrangements must comply with very specific timing rules and rules governing when the initial deferral election can be made. Why everybody cares about this is the penalties are harsh. Failure to comply with the 409A requirements result in a accelerated income taxation for the employee and a 20% penalty tax on the amounts involved. So it's something that everybody tries to avoid. In order to avoid subjecting any delayed salary payments, whether they're paid as in the form of salary at a later date or equity at a later date, they can be structured, and I think what many companies who've been implementing programs like this have done is structured them so that the deferred arrangement, the deferred equity, is paid no later than the end of the short-term deferral period, which is March 15th, the year following the year in which the compensation would otherwise have been paid, invested. And so then you're clearly out of the 409A rules. Another way is to have the employer not make any specific commitment to repay the foregone salary amounts, and there would be two separate arrangements. An equity arrangement would be a completely separate arrangement. That approach is more difficult, especially given what we've just discussed on messaging and employee communications and having everything delivered as a package. And if this approach is followed to avoid 409A issues, employee communications will have to be crafted very carefully, again with legal counsel involved, to make sure you're avoiding statements that could create an expectation of a deferred payment that might result in a legal obligation, which then would implicate the deferred compensation rules under 409A. And then, of course, it's also possible to structure arrangements that are compliant with 409A, but that is a much more cumbersome process and definitely will involve a careful legal analysis of when that compensation is paid, and the timing of the initial announcement, an election to sacrifice salary and replace it with something else. Separately from 409A, employers will also want to bear in mind any potential impact under Section 280G of the Code. Section 280G of the Code it provides for tax penalties in connection with excessive compensation, what the Code considers excessive compensation that's paid in connection with a change of control. And it's something that it is relevant to think about when implementing a program like this, because companies that are thinking about programs like this may be potential targets in M&A, right? M&A is something that the sale of the company is something that could realistically occur within the next couple of months, a year. And so at a very high level, under Section 280G, what's considered excessive compensation is determined based on an average of your 5-year past base compensation. And so by reducing the compensation amount now, you are reducing the overall average of the last 5 years, and the lower you go, potentially you're reducing that amount even further. And if the amounts payable in connection with the change in control are equal to or exceed 3 times that average base amount, then that's what triggers potential 280G issues. So just something to bear in mind: if the base amount's being reduced and if the equity compensation that is the replacement is the replacement for the reduced salary can accelerate in connection with the change control, which it typically would be, the awards would typically provide for that, then you may end up with a situation that you weren't otherwise expecting on a 280G analysis in connection with any change in control. So that's another thing to bear in mind when considering one of these programs.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Well, I know we've got a number of questions from the audience, which I'd like to get to. Just briefly cover the next topic, which is potential advantages. In the UK and in France, there are arrangements that would enable employers to make savings, not just from the reduced pay, but also from tax and social security. And these might include, for example, CSOP options in the UK. There are some potential risks attached to that and to the use of these plans in France, tax favourable plans in France, depending on how it's implemented. And of course, there are dangers associated with or risks associated with replacing pay that people might otherwise receive in cash with shares. So you'd have to be careful about implementation and dealing with those risks. If I may, I'd like to move quickly on to our conclusions before opening it back up to the audience for the poll again. We'll ask the same question again, and then we'll take questions from the floor. I'd like to ask each of Alex, Vicky, and Frank in turn to answer very quickly whether you think this is a worthwhile route for employers in your jurisdiction to follow. So, Alex. Your general conclusion, Alex, in 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, for France, it's maybe one of the routes, but we have to keep in mind that questioning the acquired right of the employees, in particular the remuneration, is still taboo in France, and most of the unions are reluctant to negotiate agreements which would reduce the employees' rights and benefits. So we noticed some modification in the state of mind of the union since 2007, and the use of the collective performance agreement mechanism could be a way to implement such collective reduction of the remuneration of the employees. and at least the only legal way to enforce a modification of the remuneration against all the employees. So we will see what will happen in the next weeks and months, because a lot of agreements are currently under negotiation with the unions. Not mechanism like proposed today, so reduction of salary against grant of shares, but at least reduction of remuneration, reduction of working time. And we see this modification in the state of mind of the unions, where they accept to sign agreements even if they are detrimental to the employees' benefits and rights.
Great, thanks, Alex. Frank, same question.
Well, yeah, I think it is a tool, I think, that can indeed work, and I think that has already been discussed during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, in depth, of course. But I think it is the same discussion again. It may not be the solution for every employer or every company in Germany, but for quite a few, I would say. And in particular, although a certain number of employees currently in Germany are already on the short-time work regime, and which means that their salary is already reduced to a certain extent, perhaps for them it will be very difficult to agree on another reduction of their salary, but not all. And since short-time work in Germany has some other requirements to be fulfilled, and not all employers do fulfill those requirements, and insofar, since it is also that there has already been discussed kind of tool that I think can motivate employees to work for the employer, to continue to work for the employer, that can indeed avoid dismissals and redundancy. I would say yes, for Germany it is a valid tool, and it can work indeed.
Great, Vicky.
Yeah, no, I'm nodding vigorously. I agree. Same for the US. I think, look, no employer wants to be in the position to have to cut salaries, but given the alternative, layoff or furlough in a market where there's otherwise little opportunity for new employment, it's certainly a worthwhile route for employers to consider to help mitigate the need for other cost reduction strategies. And for public companies, there's some PR benefits too. It signals to the market that, you know, we're all in this with you. Management's taking reduction. We're taking more in the form of equity. ISS loves that type of arrangement, right? More equity, less upfront cash. So I think that there's some real advantages to this as one of the options to consider when companies trying to preserve cash.
Okay, so in summary, the answer from the panel is yes, up to a point. So let's go to the poll again and see if everyone agrees with this. So the question, just to remind you, is could equity be used effectively to replace a significant proportion of an employee's salary?
The answers are streaming in. Most people have voted. I'm going to give you another 3 or 4 seconds to vote. The vast majority of you have voted. More than 3/4 of you have voted. And I'm going to close the poll now. And here are the results.
Great, thanks. So we've increased the definitelys, and we've increased the yes up to a point. So I think we've achieved something. And you know, a few absolutely not. I think the absolutely not may be a response to the word significant, and I guess that's a matter of what people consider significant. And I probably agree that we're not talking about the lion's share of someone's salary. It's probably, we're probably looking at, you know, 10, 20%, that kind of region. Great. So Ian, I think we may have some questions on the floor.
We have several questions. I'd actually like to start with one from Christian Holbrook, who is asking, starts off in a private equity context, but it widens out. In that context, he's saying the management might take a significant portion of remuneration in the form of equity, but management expects certain protections under the investment agreement against actions that might decrease the value of their equity. And he'd like to ask the panel whether you would expect, assuming that equity to be made up, to make up a larger portion of the salaries of non-management, that non-management equity participants would seek and should get similar protections, and how might that reasonably be structured? I think this is an excellent question. In fact, if I had put my thinking hat on to come up with a question myself, I think this might have been it. So thank you, Christian.
It is a very interesting question, and I think, you know, obviously geared towards private companies, because in the public company context, it wouldn't, you know, those kind of protections are just simply not available because you've got a single class of share that, you know, where the protections are all the same and they're somewhat limited. It would be unusual for those kinds of protections to be available to employees at large, in my experience, because they are individually negotiated at a management level. And it would be difficult to do that in a program of this kind. But I don't know, Vicky, whether you've got any particular views on that from your PE experience.
Yeah, I agree with that. And where we've seen salary reduction programs, it's not, there haven't been any more undertakings than we will pay you this equity, and the equity may represent a larger portion of the foregone salary as the sort of additional plus side, but the contractual entitlements are it will be paid to you at this later date, rather than any additional kind of preference shares or anything like that. It's I think any added benefit would be in terms of quantity rather than the nature of the equity that's being provided.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll move on to another question. This one comes from Susan Cuff. And she's saying, outside of situations where salaries are potentially having to be reduced, does the panel think that offering equity as part of the remuneration package allow the employer to offer a lower than market rate base salary? And she goes on to say, in startup companies, this is quite a common approach, but she's wondering how this might be viewed in established companies. And she suggests also that this approach might be viewed with some skepticism from her experience in the UK. But what are the panelists' experience of this? And maybe the perception is slightly different in different territories.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that from a UK perspective. Of course, the market's very different at the moment, and you know, we're facing unique circumstances where, if the choice is between losing your job in, as Vicky said, a very difficult market for finding another one, and getting a reduction in return for some equity, then it's, you know, a different kind of consideration, and you're not really thinking about what market rate you would achieve elsewhere because you're not going to get it. But I, you know, in a more protected environment where labour has better protections, it may well be different. So maybe Alex, you could comment first. You're muted again.
Sorry. Yeah, well, in France, we can see such kind of arrangements which are usual for specific businesses, in particular the tech business or venture capital when you want to start your business. We can have, well, that's a practice in France. So you offer the employee a remuneration which will lower than the market, but as a counterpart, the employee will accept so to receive shares or bonds, and they know that if the company is performing, there will be a return and they will receive money more than what they could have received if they had accepted a market rate salary. So that's the only case in France where employees would accept that. Otherwise, as indicated previously, in France, remuneration is really the acquired right of the employees, and questioning the remuneration, talking about a potential remuneration is not acceptable, even if by most of the employees. The only people who could accept that would be key managers, in particular business, for example. But it's really because we have people who accept the risk and they know what could be what could be the benefit for them to accept such kind of arrangement.
Yeah, and I'd imagine, Vicky, probably what I said about the UK probably stands for the US, does it?
Yeah, I think that the other thing to just bear in mind, because the US is a more straightforward jurisdiction, but it is when reducing salaries to bear in mind that any reduction below a certain threshold may put people in who are otherwise going to be exempt employees into a non-exempt category, and then that may impact overtime, your overtime arrangements. And then, I think nobody's talking about this drastic a salary reduction, but there are minimum wage requirements in certain states that will also just need to be complied with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Frank, any quick comment from a German perspective on?
Well, in very short, certainly the German minimum wage act should not be reduced, so shouldn't be lower than that. For all employers that are covered by collective bargaining agreements or where the wages are agreed in collective bargaining agreements, also I would say difficult to reduce the salaries there. But for companies that are not covered by collective bargaining agreements and in, let's say, some higher managerial levels and for a certain period of time, I think, and if the employees could be shown a certain chance for the future, it can indeed be an alternative. And I would even say if you have a good argument in the company's a certain situation, that may indeed be a good alternative.
And I would also add, I guess, that if the market hits a particular company in such a way that the shares look undervalued at the moment, then and the employees can see that, then they might value the shares in the same way that an employee might value the shares in the tech context. So, as the questioner said, in the tech scenario, people will take shares instead of cash because they recognise that there's a good chance, or some chance, that they will receive a bumper amount in future. If they can see that because of the way that the markets are at the moment and they think the value is depressed, then they may well take the same position in relation to a more substantial, more mature company.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just in relation to that point, but if the share price is quite suppressed, it'll just another thing to bear in mind is it will then take more equity to replace foregone salary. So just an obvious statement, but you've got to look at what's available under your plan. And if you're a public company, you might need to go to shareholders to get approval for more shares under the plan because it just takes more to replace. The equity grants will need to be larger.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Ian. Next question.
Very good. Those questions were excellent. We are now out of time, but believe it or not, those two questions, they're very broad questions, and they've covered off several other questions that came in as specific questions. So I think really we have done the job on the questions. So beyond questions and comments, it's really just down to me to thank everybody. I would like to thank once again the ESOP Centre members and the FS Club sponsors for their forbearance and for letting us run this extensive program. I think this program of webinars is fascinating. I listen to most of the ones that that I'm not hosting, and this particular one I've really been looking forward to, because although I've taken a deep interest in employee share ownership for a long time, I've only really looked at it in the context of the UK before, and I've often wondered how this might work in other territories, and now I feel I know a lot more about it from having heard this. So many thanks for that. Just a few words about the other resources that we have in the ESOP Centre. We have these regular bulletins which you can subscribe to. We have Newspad, which is very popular with ESOP Centre members, but it's available for anyone to subscribe if they wish through the web address that is on this slide. And we have FS Club bulletins. The other thing that I would like to say, if you've enjoyed this webinar and enjoy our webinars, is that we have several coming up in the next week or two. We have another one on employee share ownership next week on the 7th. which is on employee ownership and the future of capitalism. That's on Monday. On Wednesday, Financial Centers of the World, focus on the Turks and Caicos. And then on Thursday, Regulation and Recovery, EU Financial Services in our emerging world. And then the following Monday, can I really be an inventor if I work in finance? Patent protections for financial innovations. I think that'll be a very interesting one. As well, just go to the website and you can see all of the webinars that are available to you. I just want to say one more thing about today's webinar, just in case people wanted some more detailed resources on these topics. Our wonderful panel of guests not only prepared this excellent webinar, but have prepared a slide deck with a lot more information in it. So if there are those of you who prefer death by PowerPoint because you get a whole load of slides that you can use afterwards, the joy of this event was that you didn't have death by PowerPoint, but there is the pack of detailed slides available to you if you want to see them, which I think many of you on the line today will find very useful. So please do go back to the website and grab those. So there's a PDF waiting for anybody who wants to grab them. So it's really just down to me to thank our speakers. This would be the stage if we were all together, that there would be a searing round of applause for the audience. We can't do that on this webinar platform. So those of you who've been watching the webinars that I'm hosting will know that I've been trying various different musical instruments to simulate applause. And I couldn't resist going for my tambourine, which is in a white case. So I thought, what better instrument to use for white case visitors than one that is in a white case. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time as well. It's been a great pleasure. Goodbye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye-bye.